Welcome back to KTAL LPFM in Las Cruces, New Mexico, 101.5 on your dial or your virtual dial. We're in a segment, Science Let's Take a Look. I'm your host, Vince Gucic, and with me in the studio today are Engineer John Nelson and Craig Ricketts. We just did a little segment about, well, two segments. One was about clearing up misconceptions about how science works. And another one was about the habitability of the planet Proxima Centauri b, found last year around our closest neighboring star, Proxima Centauri. And it's one of the three stars around there. So let me jump into another interesting thing. And what would you call it? A warning about technology, perhaps? Be careful. So there are these things called carbon nanotubes. You may have heard of them. You may have also heard of buckyballs, Buckminster fullerenes. They were discovered, 20 years ago. They're arrays of carbon atoms in these beautiful geometric patterns that had never been suspected. You get 60 of these together, and you make what looks like a soccer ball. But you can also grow these carbon compounds as long tubes. And they are phenomenally strong, certainly on the small scale. And they can be embedded in lots of things. People are using them for parts of, say, bicycle frames, because you can embed them in a matrix like epoxy and make an extremely strong, lightweight material. They're also being considered or being used, really, for capacitors, electrical capacitors, supercapacitors. Going back to consumer use, they're in skis, they're in baseball bats, they're even in water filters. And here's where something comes up that's interesting. In the December 8th, 2017 issue of Science, the magazine of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, there was a report that these carbon nanotubes, as they're floating around and can reach tissues such as lungs, can cause mesothelioma. It's a cancer, and very few people survive it. Stephen Jay Gould, a famous writer about evolution, contracted it, and I believe he even sued Harvard because there was asbestos in his office there. I think he died of something else, but anyway, it's a pretty nasty disease. So the original report about mesothelioma in mice was published in another journal called Current Biology, and it's volume 27 on page 3302, and that's by Chernova and others. This kind of concern was expressed for a number of years, and also going back to 2013, there was a joint publication by the Department of Health and Human Services, the Centers for Disease Control, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, OSHA. The report was named Occupational Exposure to Carbon Nanotubes and Nanofibers. So where's the risk? Who's at risk? Are consumers at risk? Well, if these are in a baseball bat and they're already embedded in epoxy, they're not going to come floating out. So I wouldn't worry about breathing around baseball bats or skis or bicycles. But then there's other things that are more proximate, like water filters. And I don't know how these are actually being used in water filters, but Craig, you have experience with water filters. Do you have any musings about this?
Well, actually, thank you for asking, Vince. My background is actually more in the area of air filters, but there's a nice tie-in there with asbestos. And the particular air filters that I'm thinking about at the moment are called high-efficiency particulate air filters. They're used in nuclear facilities. Almost every nuclear facility would have at least one or two, if not banks of hundreds of those, like a nuclear power plant would have hundreds of these types of filters. filtering the exhaust air. But the history of these filters goes back to World War I. And it
World War One? Really?
That's correct. Really, the more recent development started in World War II, but the history started with the gas masks that the German army developed for the gas warfare that was being conducted at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And in those days, they were actually using fibers of asbestos
In the gas mask?
in the gas masks.
Oh,
So that continued on without anybody realizing the issues with asbestos at that time, all the way up into World War II, when they finally increased the scale of these filters such that they could be used in military command and control systems. So these filters might be on the order of 24 inches by 24 inches square by 1 foot deep, with what they call a pleated medium configuration, whereby they got almost 20 square meters of filtration area into that small volume.
so does this look like the furnace filters with the pleats, or even
Exactly.
more elaborate?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're a little bit more elaborate. The performance specifications are higher. So it wasn't until, I believe, maybe the late 50s, the early 60s, when asbestos became recognized as an issue. And only at that time did they start removing the asbestos fibers and switching over to a great extent to glass fibers
Uh-huh.
of submicron diameter.
So if I have a HEPA filter for our vacuum cleaner, and they say HEPA, that's glass fiber then?
Yes, that's correct.
Huh.
In today's world.
Right.
50 years ago, it might not have been.
Uh-huh.
But today, you're perfectly safe from the asbestos perspective.
But let's say you have a water filter. Now, again, you say you do air filters primarily. Would you have any feeling about having carbon nanotubes in a water filter? I don't even know what the configuration is. I didn't dig into this.
Well, with air filters, there's something that's referred to as fiber shedding, which happens on the downstream side when the small submicron diameter fibers, which are maybe like 1/10 the diameter of a human hair, literally get carried off of the downstream surface by the airflow. I could imagine, this is somewhat speculative, that there could be that possibility for these carbon nanotube fibers, if that's the configuration and geometry that they're intended to be used in, could actually maybe leave the downstream side of the water filter.
Yeah. Well, I remember having asbestos pads that we had Bunsen burners under, and asbestos gloves for the lab. When asbestos became a big concern, I remember the lab manager, Dave Sullenberger, came around to collect our asbestos gloves and our asbestos pads, and he had tongs. He wouldn't touch them. We had our hands in these things for years. But even more scary, I remember going to automobile garages, and you'd see people, mechanics, blasting out all of the accumulations of worn out brake pads from the brake drums, and those were asbestos. You'd see this cloud of stuff, and I probably inhaled some of them too. Maybe we were all lucky. And I know there's also 3 different forms of asbestos. There's still an operating asbestos mine in, I think it's Ontario, where we visited once, and they're claiming that this form is not that bad. Other interesting thing is talcum powder is a magnesium silicate, and it's closely related to asbestos. I don't like to inhale that stuff either, although it's not long fibers. It's apparently the thing that long fibers can penetrate cells and cause biochemical changes. Maybe cells sense this as a particular signal proliferating wildly or something. But it's pretty interesting. So I'm not sure what's happening. What regulations and protections are being considered for both airborne and waterborne carbon nanotubes. These things are really small, of course. You said that the glass fibers are 1/10 the diameter of the human hair. So let's see, what does that make it? Human hairs are what, maybe some fraction of several, well, maybe tens of
They're about
micrometers?
150 microns, I believe.
Oh, okay. So that we put these glass fibers in a HEPA filter at maybe 15 micrometers. Well,
Or
let's see,
even
a carbon
smaller.
nanotube is maybe tens of atomic diameters, so that puts them, let me think, it's about maybe 2 nanometers, much, much smaller. Yeah. So compared to the diameter of the cell, a typical cell, that's much, much smaller. So do bigger and smaller fibers make a difference? I don't know. Maybe the mice certainly seem to think so. And so does OSHA and these other people. So that's probably enough to say about carbon nanotubes. But let me give you a flavor of other things. We're going to talk about some on this show, perhaps, and all kinds of later shows. I would also like to have your suggestions about what we might cover. I can take comments. You can text my phone. It's 575-571-2269. You can email me at vince@lascrucesacademy.org. That's the nonprofit private school where I'm the board chair and for which this is an outreach activity. And you can also go to my website, science-technology-society.com, and leave a comment there. Anyway, some of the ideas. How far can you see in a rainstorm? There's some really interesting things you can do almost on the level of a thought experiment. You look at a drop and you figure out how fast the rain is coming down, so how many raindrops there are in a volume, and use a little bit of theory about how things get in each other's way in the line of sight, and you have an idea. Another one that we'll probably get into this time is, how cold is that rain? Rain always feels cold. It's even colder than the air, and we can examine why. Here's one that just popped up into my mind a few days ago. The peopling of Australia. So how did people maybe 70,000 years ago go across 100 kilometers, 60 miles of ocean before anybody else had boats? And then they made a thriving culture that's the oldest living culture on the planet. Before I detail some more stuff and get into another segment, we're going to take a station break. So please keep listening to KTAL LP FM 101.5 in Las Cruces. And this is Science. Let's take a look. I'm your host, Vince Gucic. And today I have John Nelson and Craig Ricketts with me in the studio. Thanks.